On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, Congress wants some U.S. maritime reform. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So a couple of days without an episode, my apologies. Been a lot going on, both in schoolwork here at Campbell University in beautiful North Carolina, but also in the shipping industry, and been watching and digesting a lot of information going on. So we got a host of videos on your way, no worries. We'll be back on track for getting you episodes out about what's going on in the maritime sector. But before we do that, this letter came out from the U.S. Congress, signed by 17 members of Congress, House and Senate, Republican and Democrat, asking President Biden to initiate a series of reforms for the U.S. maritime industry. Now, understand, the maritime industry has been in a downward spiral for a long time. It's not President Biden, it's across Democrat and Republican administrations for quite a while. And this letter is advocating three specific recommendations. We're going to look at those recommendations and see what chance they have of success. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. So here's the story by Mike Schuller over at G-Captain. Bipartisan lawmakers urge President Biden to strengthen U.S. maritime power. Now, this is led by two members of Congress, Representative Mike Waltz from Florida, the 6th District, Republican, and Senator Mark Kelly, a Democrat from Arizona. Mark Kelly is a graduate of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. I actually went to school with his brother, Scott Kelly, the astronaut. Scott Kelly was actually my indoctrination officer at SUNY Maritime. He was 2 years ahead of me. But Waltz and Kelly issued this letter to President Biden asking them to fortify the U.S. maritime power amid pressure from China. So let's take a look at that letter. So in the letter, they talk about a couple of things. Number one, they talk about the fact that the U.S. is at an inflection point in international maritime affairs. And they highlight the role of the People's Republic of China in expanding their influence across the world's oceans. They say it is building a global maritime network, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, on which American economy and critical maritime supply chains have become increasingly reliant. And that is true. Look how much trade we're doing with China, how much of that trade is carried by ships of Chinese registry, Chinese built, or Chinese mariners on board. Meanwhile, the U.S. has failed to give proper attention to the elements of national sea power. While we have the #1 Navy in the world, we have allowed our maritime sector to decline. And understand, this is not new, been going on for a long time. It goes on that the U.S. maritime infrastructure is aging, including our naval and commercial yards, which once produced the world's finest ships. This has been going on globally, by the way, too. World shipyards, number of shipyards around the world have decreased by 40% since 2009. But what we did back in the 80s was end what was called construction and operational differential subsidies. Under a program began back in 1936, we had a system to provide subsidies differentials so that we can build in the U.S. because of the higher costs associated with it. And what that did was put ships out on the international trade. Well, when we ended that subsidy, what we saw was ships shifted registries to open registries, flags of conveniences, Panama, Liberia, the Marshall Islands, and shipbuilding went overseas, so that now 94% of the world's ships are built in China, Korea, and Japan, with China being the one growing at the fastest rate. It goes on here, our global competitors are strengthening their maritime industries, and asymmetric forces are threatening freedom of navigation and international law of sea. They specifically highlight the Chinese role in the South China Sea and the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. Understand, after World War II, the United States and its allies turned the world's oceans into this open commons. You can move ships around without any concern. It's one of the reasons why open registries took hold. Prior to that, you needed the protection of navies, but in 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there's really no threat. Now, there are regional threats that appear time and time again, but largely you can sail the world's oceans without any concern, meaning you didn't have to pay those pesky taxes necessary for things like, a navy, for example. So that Panama, Liberia, the Marshall Islands can build these fleets very low cost without that pesky overhead of corporate taxes and other taxes to fund militaries. Now, what we're seeing today is that China and the Houthi are requiring the need for navies. And now the U.S. and its allies have to step up and protect these ships that are not paying anything in terms of defense, which is a big change. And we're seeing that reflective today. The third paragraph here, in response to the maritime risk, congressional and administrative leaders across the enterprise have called for action. So, for example, the Secretary of Navy had this great speech up in Harvard. I did a breakdown of that speech. You can see it up above, where he talked about what's called the maritime statecraft. Great book by Brent Sadler over at Heritage talks about this. So how do you create these favorable conditions for the U.S.? And what they want to do here is kind of de-risk the maritime domain, their phrase. So they have 3 specific recommendations that they propose. So these recommendations are across the board. So number 1, establish an interagency maritime policy coordinator reporting to the president with consummate rank and authority to synchronize national maritime policy and influence industrial-based resource decisions across military, civil, and commercial dimensions. So you're sitting there probably going, well, wait a minute, I thought we have a maritime administrator for that. Well, yes, we do. Admiral Ann Phillips, who previous U.S. Navy, now the administrator of MARAD, is that person. But that person reports to the Secretary of Transportation. Plus, the current makeup of the Maritime Administration doesn't have all those functions under them. Over time, what we have done is diminish the power of the Maritime Administration. This is across multiple administrations. This has happened. So, for example, international trade is now under the purview of the Federal Maritime Commission, where it used to be under the Maritime Administration, back when it was called the Maritime Commission. What this proposes is the creation of a single individual to do it. Now, interestingly enough, there is federal law for this. If you look at 46 Code 51701, there's something called the US Maritime Service. And what the US Maritime Service is it was created under the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, Section 13 of 1938, created this. Now, the law says this: the Secretary of Transportation, Secretary Buttigieg, may establish and maintain a voluntary organization to be known as the U.S. Maritime Service for the training of citizens of the U.S. to serve on merchant vessels of the United States and to perform functions to assist the U.S. Merchant Marine as determined necessary by the Secretary. Well, this sounds like a training role, and that's kind of what it was. Matter of fact, when graduates of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy are graduated, they become ensigns in the U.S. Maritime Service, and they remain ensigns because there's no promotion track in the U.S. Maritime Service, unless they become the head of a maritime college, at which point they're promoted to Rear Admiral. So you go from ensign to Rear Admiral. There's no in between. But the U.S. Maritime Service, the administrator is the commandant of the U.S. Maritime Service. But the idea here is that the Secretary of Transportation could appoint someone into this role because, as it says here, to assist the U.S. Merchant Marine as determined necessary by the Secretary. So it doesn't have to just be training. You can do it. Now, this sounds strange, but believe it or not, it was done. In World War II, William Knutson was brought into the U.S. Army. He was an executive in the automobile industry. And while we were ramping up for World War II, there was a realization that we need someone from the automotive industry to help with manufacturing, but at the same time needed a little bit of rank on their shoulder to be able to talk with the military. So Knutson was brought in as a lieutenant general. Never served in the military one day, and he's made a 3-star general on day one. And Knutson served in that role. If you want to read a great book, Freedom's Forge talks about this. Him, along with Henry J. Kaiser, who does the shipbuilding in the United States. Great book. But Knutson did it. So you can bring in someone under the U.S. Maritime Service, and that person could serve in that role that they're talking about here in Recommendation 1. So Recommendation 2 is issue a presidential determination, a PD, that establishes commercial, civil, military shipbuilding and shipping industries with their associated domestic infrastructure and workforces as elements of national critical infrastructure sectors, and authorize the Department of Defense to utilize the Defense Production Act, Title III, authorities to invest in the commercial shipbuilding and shipping industries and civilian infrastructure and workforce in coordination with the Maritime Administration. So, one of the biggest things that has happened is that we have seen the diminution of our shipbuilding base, and that has played havoc with the construction of naval vessels. Because we're not building commercial vessels in the U.S., the entire private shipyard industry is geared literally to a sole source customer, the U.S. Navy. And that has created inefficiencies. And I know a lot of people want to argue it's the Jones Act. It's not the Jones Act. It is the loss in the 1980s of the international shipping that are now built overseas. Because again, to be a U.S. ship, you don't have to be U.S. built. You just have to be a U.S. built ship to operate in the coastwise trade. If you're in the international trade, you can be foreign built. And that's what we see happen. This is cost the U.S. Navy a lot of issues, because every time a new program ramps up in shipyards, they got to train new people, they got to bring them on. There's no common building of ships going on in the shipyards for the commercial industry that would keep ship fitters and welders and machinists and all those type of jobs you need. Granted, commercial ships are different than military ships, but there's still the baseline you need. And if you look over where shipbuilding is being done in China, Japan, Korea, that's what you see. In those shipyards that build naval vessels, they're building commercial vessels. And we're just not seeing that in the U.S. And that takes us to the last recommendation they have. Develop a national strategy focused on de-risking the U.S. maritime domain from the People's Republic of China and other asymmetric or emerging maritime threats, recognizing that our security and economic way of life relies on open and free sea lines of communication. So, I mean, we're seeing right now, it was Maersk Lines, for example, in Copenhagen, that decided, along with Hapag-Lloyd, to divert away from shipping in the Red Sea. And in many ways, that led to the exodus of other shipping. And it's a lack of knowledge, I would argue, across the U.S. DoD, Department of Defense, not understanding that military solution isn't the end all in the Red Sea. You have to convince the war risk insurance people that, hey, we're going to make this safer so you can lower the war risk. And there are ways to get around that. We can help subsidize war risk. And by subsidize, I don't mean you give them money. I mean you are the stopgap should a ship get hit or damaged or sunk beyond what is seen as a recognized risk. But you're not going to do that for a ship registered in Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands. Nobody wants to get in that industry of subsidizing vessels from other flags and other registries. You want to do it in America. So you've got to create this way of de-risking. Now, right now, the Maritime Administration has been charged through the National Defense Authorization Act of last year to create a maritime strategy. Unfortunately, they're not doing it. They have basically contracted it out to the Center of Naval Analysis. And as you can tell by their name, they don't do maritime, they do naval. So my fear is we're going to get a naval strategy, not a maritime strategy. And again, this could be done at the Maritime Administration, but the problem you have at the Maritime Administration is it's underfunded, understaffed. They haven't done an annual report since 2013. It's been over a decade. And what you need is somebody to come in and kind of oversee a view of the maritime industry and put together recommendations and proposals. Listen, I am not a fan of more government by any means. This is not what I'm advocating. But the problem you have in the maritime industry is you have advocacy groups that talk for their sector and their business and their, it's the unions, it's shipping companies, it's the shipbuilders. They all look after their rice bowl. They don't look at the big picture. And unfortunately, you need someone to look at the big picture, and that's not being done right now. And what this proposal signed by 17 congressmen and senators aims to do is fix this. Their very last sentence in their letter: we must act now before it is too late to reinvigorate American and allied maritime power of the seas. We're seeing right now in the Red Sea, ships sailing through the Red Seas are advocating that, hey, they have Chinese crew on board, they're sailing from China, they have a Chinese registry or Hong Kong registry, they're going through. Whereas U.S. flag vessels, British associated vessels, Western vessels are being attacked. And what we could potentially see is China takes more of a foothold in the maritime industry. This is why right now, if the U.S. wants to remain a superpower or a major power with the emergence of rival peer powers, then it has to talk about this. No one's talking about the U.S. maritime sector hauling 100% of our cargo. That's not what's being talked about. But we've seen the issues with supply chain crises. We've seen what happened during COVID. We saw what happened when Ever Given went sideways in the Suez. We're seeing what's happening in the Black Sea. We're seeing what's happening in the Red Sea. The fear is it happens in maybe the South China Sea or the Yellow Sea, and then it impacts the Blue Sea, all the oceans, and then global trade is in distress. This is why Congress, I would argue right now, is calling for action. And I am hopeful that we may see something positive. Hopeful, not confident, but hopeful. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Well, first off, give it a big thumbs up. Second of all, you can hit that super thanks button down below and contribute to the page, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. That helps me keep this page up and running. Until our next video, and you're going to love the next videos because, man, there's been a lot going on behind the scenes, including Sal getting yelled at by 2 shipping companies, a union, you name it. I get a lot of flack, and I am happy to talk about it with you because it is a great story. Until our next episode, this is Sal, signing off.